So I have when you drafted this bill, when you started to analyze it, did we have a number of how many written letters by school administrators on record, how many granted permission in New York State to have a firearm other than a school resource officer? Do we have that data?
Can you repeat the question?
The question is, how many actual letters were written by school administrators giving permission to someone who legally possesses a firearm to carry it on school grounds?
I don't have that information.
As a retired lieutenant from the police department in New York City, I think that's something that should have been the first step before we look to legislate and put a mandate on a school district restricting who they can allow. Because if there's no need for it, if we don't have the actual letter being written, then there's no reason to legislate it, in my opinion. Now, I also, talking about how Mr. Goodell spoke about the rural school districts, because in New York City, I can tell you right now, the mayor and the chancellor are never ever going to give permission to someone to carry a firearm, right, in a school building other than the NYPD, and fully support that. The issue becomes what Mr. Goodell said: when we have a school resource officer in a rural school district, that school resource officer, if he gets hurt, he's out line of duty for a week. That small department probably can't replace them for that week. So you have a guy like me that may live in the school district. My kids may attend there. I'm a retired police officer. I can't carry my gun on school grounds because I am a retired member. I'm no longer active. But if I can volunteer my time for that week, not employed as a school resource officer, currently the school administrator can say, you know what, thank you so much for covering for this week. I'm going to write the letter and allow you to do it. This will take that away. And we will now, as Mr. Goodell pointed out, we will leave that school without a school resource officer. Now, that's a big, and I understand your intent about not having teachers. I agree. This, in my opinion, the legislation is too broad, where it will prevent someone like me who's retired and wanted to volunteer my time because that school resource officer got hurt in the line of duty and is no longer able to protect our school. Do you think that this goes above and beyond teachers carrying?
I don't, because I think there's a big difference between, there's been talk about there's these highly skilled teachers, but there's a big difference between a teacher that's highly skilled at the shooting range to a police officer that is trained to be able to be a targeted shooter, to put down a targeted shooter. And I believe even in rural districts, there are retired police officers that could get the license, and that could be made available then to them, and they could be on a list of people that, when needed, they could be hired by the school district. So I do not think this is too broad. I think New York State, it's incumbent upon us to keep our state as safe as it can be. As was mentioned previously, it's the states that have the strongest gun laws seem to have the least shooting massacres. So I'm all for anything that we can do in our schools to make them safer, and I believe this bill does just that.
But the intent is really to stop teachers from being armed, correct?
It's to stop teachers from being armed and also have specific personnel available. As mentioned, school resource officers, police officers, peace officers, security guards. This bill only applies to employees of the school. So this bill is just applying to teachers and administrators in the school.
It doesn't. It actually is anybody, in my opinion, reading the bill, it's anybody that has a licensed firearm cannot get written permission from the school administrator to act as a temporary fill-in. That's exactly what it says.
No, this bill does not say this. This bill is just directed at the employees of the school.
No, it says, just the title alone says the ability to authorize the possession of weapon on school grounds. So that means me as a retired member of the police department, because under New York state law, I am no longer a police officer. I am a permit holder with New York City. So I no longer can have written permission from the school administrator to fill in because I'm not technically an employee. This is what this bill does.
Question. Is that a question, sir?
Do you agree?
No, I don't.
Okay.
So I'm reading the bill right now, shall issue such written authorization to any teacher, school administrator, or other person employed at the school who is not primarily employed as a school resource officer, police officer, peace officer, or security guard, who has been issued a special armed guard registration card, as defined in 89F of the General Business Law.
What you just read actually is the exact thing that I'm stating. I'm the retiree volunteering for a week. I'm not employed by the school district. I don't have an armed guard license. The school administrator cannot give me permission to fill in for that week that the school resource officer is outlined a duty.
Yeah. Okay.
Do you agree that that's, because it says other person. You just read it.
So, yeah, and prior to what I just read, it says without the written authorization of such educational institution. Other person employed.
I know, but isn't this bill banning the school administrator from giving that permission?
The school administrator has the charge over the employees in the school.
Yes, I totally understand that. But this legislation is telling the school administrator that they're no longer allowed to give me permission, writing a letter saying that I can possess a firearm to volunteer.
Yeah, so in this bill, they're not allowed to give authorization to employees of the school, meaning teachers, other administrators, coaches, whoever
PTA
it may
members?
be.
PTA members?
If they're not employed by the school.
Okay.
So, so it's only talking about what they can do for employees in a school. All districts will be able to hire people with the appropriate license to be at their school. Those people are trained and are experienced, and they're not wearing two hats. It's very hard to have a teacher wear two hats, so this bill is confined to the school administrators are not hiring their teachers and people in their school, the educators, to be armed with guns to protect their students.
You just mentioned something that they can't wear two hats. A school resource officer, by definition, wears two hats. They are a teacher and they are law enforcement. That is, by definition, what a school resource officer is. Do you think it's incapable of someone to actually be able to have a dual role in a school?
What I am saying is anyone a person who's authorized and has the appropriate license can come in with the authorization. They can volunteer or they can be paid by a district. So a school resource officer who is employed to protect the children can do just that.
Okay, fair enough. So just going back to my first question, since we don't know the number of actual letters that were written for our 600 school districts, how many administrators actually gave permission for someone other than an employee to carry a firearm on school grounds? We don't have that data, right?
No, as I said, I do not. Okay. I do not personally have that information.
Would you think it would be a good idea to actually see how this in real life, in real time, how this would impact school districts and how many have already given that permission? Do you think that would be a good idea?
No, I don't think it's necessary because I believe in the climate that we live in, where there are shootings weekly, I think what is most important is to keep our schools safe. And if you have been to many gun rallies for safe gun legislation, not only are students so scared about what happened in Parkland or some of these other places, but they are frightened about it happening at their school. And they are frightened about their teacher having a gun in their drawer. So with the climate that we live in, and with talks of our federal government possibly allowing states across the country to have firearms, with Betsy DeVos stating that federal money that's earmarked for education could be then given to schools for firearm or to train their teachers, I think it's very important at this particular time to have this legislation, because I think it's essential.
Oh, all right. But since we're not dealing with hypotheticals, right? Because we can't control what the federal government's going to do. We can control what we can do for our school districts in New York State, I believe. And for me, we are limiting our school districts who may be challenged with having funding for a school resource officer. And this bill will stop them from being able to allow a retiree volunteer his time. That would protect the school. That's exactly what this will do.
No, I mean, as I stated before, someone like you who's retired, a retired police officer, and has the appropriate license from the DEC, he can apply to be a volunteer security guard at the school.
I will tell you now, if the school resource officer gets hurt this week and cannot come to work tomorrow, and as someone like me who's a retiree, today, right now, before this is passed, the principal can write a letter and say, hey, Mike, do me a favor, fill in tomorrow, you got it, I'll help out. This will prevent that from happening.
Yeah, this bill will allow for that. A school district could have a list of retirees that are willing to come in and be a security officer, and also as long as they have that license. As they don't have to have the license. Okay.
Negative.
Only the employees.
Negative.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry. It's not accurate, because
And if you can just let me say one thing. It's okay. What I didn't make clear is if you are the retired police officer who wants to volunteer, you can come into the school and volunteer, and only the employees of the school need to have that license. If an employee of the school, they cannot have that position unless they have the license.
Actually, I can't, because after the SAFE Act was passed, if I step on school grounds with my firearm, I'm a felon. Because I'm a retired police officer, not active. So I'm being honest with you, because that's exactly what it became.
If you had written authorization to be there, and you were retired, and you were on the list of volunteers that is willing to come in and act as a security guard at that school, you would still be able to. So we're not limiting districts from being able to do that.
But isn't this taking away the written permission? Or, I mean, you read it before. It says, and others.
Yeah. This is taking away, schools they can still have a written permission. They just can't have that for employees. So employees cannot be designated for this position.
So as a CEC member, when I was the school board president in New York City, which is the old school boards, I was an elected volunteer. Under New York City rules, I was technically a part-time employee, right? So would that mean what's the definition that you are using in this bill as employee?
I would say, yeah. I would just say it was, if he is paid by the school district, then he would be considered an employee,
exactly,
whether part-time or not.
Exactly, but if I'm a volunteer, I'm not getting paid. So the school administrator cannot give me permission then. Is that correct?
Yes. Repeat that, please.
So if I'm a volunteer, I'm not getting paid. I'm not, under that definition that you just gave, I'm not an employee. So therefore, the school administrator cannot give me written permission. Is that correct?
If you are not employed by the school, so
Yep.
you've asked so many different ways, so it's a little confusing. If you're not employed by the school, so if you're not a part-time employee or you're not any affiliation with the school and you are volunteering, you can have that written authorization.
Mr. Reilly, your time has expired.
Thank you.
On this 15, and
Thank you so much for giving me the time.
certainly. Mr.